The flight of dreams. As the sun began its slow climb over the horizon, bathing the world in a golden hue, 12-year-old Leonard Thompson walked confidently through the automatic sliding doors of the bustling airport. His hazel eyes shimmered with anticipation, reflecting the terminal lights like tiny beacons of excitement. Leonard wasn't just any boy. He was a dreamer, an aviation enthusiast whose knowledge of aircraft rivaled many adults. A small, well-worn backpack adorned with airplane stickers was slung over his shoulders, a testament to his deep passion for all things flight. Inside, cradled like a treasure, was his aviation manual, filled with scribbled notes, sketches of cockpit controls, and diagrams meticulously labeled in his neat handwriting. Beside him, his mother, Rachel, pulled the black suitcase that squeaked rhythmically over the polished tiles. Her tired but proud smile warmed the space between them. This trip was Leonard's dream come true, a gift that Rachel had spent months working extra hours for. Late nights cleaning offices, weekends spent babysitting neighbors' kids, and countless sacrifices. Every dollar had been saved with the hope that her son's face would light up when they boarded the plane. "Mom, look," Leonard shouted suddenly, pointing through the tall terminal windows. "That's a Boeing 737 MAX over there. And next to it, an Airbus A320. His voice carried such conviction and precision that even the weary travelers around him turned to admire his enthusiasm. A businessman in a suit raised an eyebrow, impressed. Rachel chuckled softly. "Leo, you know more about planes than the pilots probably do," she said with a hint of teasing. Leonard grinned widely, his cheeks flushed with pride. "I'll be one of them someday, Mom. Just wait." Their boarding gate was a hive of activity. Passengers checked their phones, parents corralled kids, and an intercom voice periodically reminded everyone to keep their boarding passes ready. Leonard couldn't contain his excitement. His eyes darted around, absorbing every detail. He craned his neck to see the tarmac where mechanics worked beneath towering aircraft, the faint smell of jet fuel drifting in from the open gates. For him, this was paradise. When their group was finally called to board, Leonard nearly sprinted ahead before his mother caught his backpack strap. "Slow down, Captain Leo," she teased. "The plane isn't going anywhere without us." As they entered the jet bridge, Leonard's heart raced. Each step brought him closer to the machine that would soon defy gravity. He practically held his breath as they stepped into the narrow aisle of the plane, his senses overwhelmed. The plush seats, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the overhead lights flickering with life. It was more beautiful than he had imagined. His eyes wandered toward the cockpit as they passed the open door. The array of buttons, switches, and glowing screens filled him with awe. He wished he could sit there, even for a second. "Welcome aboard," said a smiling flight attendant, breaking his trance. Rachel nudged him toward their row, where Leonard eagerly claimed the window seat. He buckled his seatbelt with practiced ease and pressed his face against the cool glass. "Mom," he said excitedly, his voice muffled against the window, "did you know a Boeing 737 can climb at over 2,000 feet per minute during takeoff?" Rachel laughed, adjusting her own seatbelt. "You're full of fun facts, Leo. Now sit back, relax, and let the professionals handle things." The cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight rituals. Passengers stowed bags in overhead bins, families adjusted their seats, and the faint crackle of the PA system signaled the start of the safety demonstration. Leonard absorbed every word, even as other passengers scrolled through their phones or dozed off. Then came the moment he had been waiting for. Takeoff. The engines roared to life, the vibration of the immense power tingling through his seat. Leonard's heart raced as the plane began rolling down the runway, faster and faster until the entire cabin seemed to surge forward. Then, with a graceful lift, they were airborne. Leonard pressed his face against the window, watching as the ground fell away, and the vast expanse of sky swallowed them whole. Below, the world shrank into a miniature landscape of roads, rivers, and tiny buildings. "This is incredible," he whispered to himself, a wide grin splitting his face. As the flight reached cruising altitude, Leonard's excitement didn't wane. When a flight attendant passed, he raised his hand timidly. "Excuse me, ma'am. What's our altitude right now?" The woman blinked, momentarily caught off guard, then smiled. "We're at about 35,000 feet, young man. Are you interested in aviation?" Leonard's face lit up. "Yes. I study aviation manuals and practice on simulators. I know how autopilot works and how to read the instrument panel." The flight attendant's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine admiration. "You're going to make a great pilot someday. Keep it up," she said warmly, handing him a small wing-shaped pin bearing the airline's logo. Leonard clutched the pin as if it were solid gold. "Thank you," he beamed, carefully pinning it onto the front of his shirt. Rachel watched him, her heart swelling with pride. The hours drifted by in a pleasant haze. Leonard savored every moment. The soft hum of the engines, the gentle dips and climbs of the plane, even the in-flight meal that most passengers groaned about. To him, this flight was more than a journey. It was a taste of the future. However, just as Leonard settled back into his seat, something changed. It started with a faint jolt, barely noticeable at first. Leonard frowned, his instincts tingling. He glanced out at the wing, watching it vibrate slightly against the backdrop of clouds. Rachel noticed his sudden quiet and placed a hand on his arm. "It's just a little bump, honey. Planes hit turbulence all the time." But Leonard wasn't convinced. He had read about turbulence and studied its effects. Something about this felt different. The jolt came again, harder this time. Passengers murmured in discomfort, some glancing around nervously. The overhead lights flickered briefly. Leonard tightened his seatbelt instinctively, his fingers gripping the armrests. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's voice, calm but slightly strained. "We're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. There's nothing to worry about." But Leonard's unease grew. He watched the wings sway more aggressively now, the rhythmic hum of the engines shifting slightly. He turned to his mother, his voice low. "Mom, something's wrong." Rachel's face softened. "Leo, the pilot said it's fine. You worry too much." Leonard's gut told him otherwise. He had studied enough cockpit procedures to know that something wasn't right. He could sense it, and as the third jolt hit, this time a violent shudder that rocked the plane. The cabin erupted into chaos. Trays clattered to the floor. Passengers gasped, some shrieking in fear. The oxygen masks suddenly dropped from the ceiling, swaying like ghosts. Alarms began blaring faintly from the cockpit, and Leonard's blood ran cold. The plane tilted sharply to one side, sending drinks, foams, and bags sliding across the cabin floor. Rachel grabbed her son's hand, her knuckles white as she tried to steady herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice of the lead flight attendant quivered over the PA. "Please remain calm." Her words cut off as another jolt sent the plane lurching violently downward. Screams filled the cabin. Leonard's mind raced. Something had happened to the pilots. He could feel it. The cockpit door remained eerily silent, no reassuring voice coming over the intercom. He turned toward his mother, his eyes wide. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think the pilots are in trouble. I need to help." Rachel looked at him in disbelief, her panic spilling over. "Leo, you can't." But Leonard was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his determination cutting through the chaos. "I have to try." Into the cockpit. Leonard's heart pounded in his chest as he unbuckled his seatbelt, the sharp snap of the buckle sounding louder than it should have amidst the chaos of the cabin. Around him, passengers clutched their seats and oxygen masks, their panicked whispers like an eerie chorus beneath the blaring overhead alarms. He could feel his mother's frantic gaze burning into his back, but he didn't dare turn around. If he stopped to explain now, he might lose the courage to do what had to be done. The plane rocked again, the violent dip sending his stomach into freefall. A flight attendant, the same woman who had admired his aviation knowledge earlier, stumbled down the aisle, gripping seatbacks for support. Leonard caught her eye as she passed. Her expression was strained, her smile gone, replaced by sheer desperation. "Mom!" Leonard shouted over the noise, his voice cracking with urgency. "Something's wrong with the pilots. Please, you have to check the cockpit." The flight attendant stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as though she were about to argue. But something in Leonard's expression, a mix of fear and certainty far beyond his years, seemed to give her pause. "The pilots haven't said anything," she admitted, her voice trembling. "We haven't been able to reach them on the intercom." Leonard's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made his skin crawl. "If they're not responding, they might be unconscious. We have to check. Please, just open the..." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing toward the sealed cockpit door. The tension in her shoulders was palpable, her internal battle written across her face. Protocol dictated that the cockpit door couldn't be opened unless absolutely necessary. But this wasn't just turbulence anymore. "Please," Leonard repeated, his voice smaller now. "I can help. You're just a kid," she said softly, more to herself than to him. But in that moment, the plane shuddered again, tilting sharply to the right. The flight attendant lost her balance, catching herself on a nearby seat. Around them, passengers screamed as drinks and bags tumbled through the aisle. That was the tipping point. "Come with me," the flight attendant said abruptly, gripping Leonard's shoulder as they moved toward the front of the cabin. Leonard's mother called out behind him, her voice panicked. "Leonard! Leonard!" "No." He turned briefly, his face pale but resolute. "I'll be okay, Mom. I promise." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't bring herself to stop him. In that moment, she saw something in her son that she had never seen before, the quiet strength of someone far beyond his age. At the cockpit door, the flight attendant punched in an emergency override code with shaking hands. The lock clicked, and the door slid open just enough for them to slip inside. Leonard's breath caught in his throat as he stepped over the threshold. The cockpit was chaos. The two pilots were slumped over in their seats, their oxygen masks dangling uselessly around their necks. The hum of alarms and flashing red lights filled the confined space, the warning tones so sharp they seemed to pierce Leonard's brain. He recognized the altitude indicator immediately, and his stomach dropped, literally and figuratively, as he saw the needle dipping lower and lower. The plane was losing altitude fast. "God," the flight attendant whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. "They're unconscious." Leonard's instincts kicked in. "We need to get them oxygen now," he said, already moving toward the pilot's seat. The flight attendant quickly adjusted both pilots' masks, tightening them over their faces, but neither stirred. Leonard didn't have time to dwell on it. His eyes were fixed on the cockpit controls, his mind racing as he took in the chaos. Everything he had learned from his flight manuals and hours on simulators came rushing back like a tidal wave. The control yoke, the throttle levers, the navigation panel. He knew what most of them did. He also knew that a single wrong move could spell disaster. "Okay," Leonard murmured to himself, swallowing hard as he climbed into the co-pilot's seat. It felt far too big for him, and his feet barely reached the pedals below. He scanned the instrument panel, noting the blinking alarms and warning lights. The plane's nose was tilted dangerously downward, and they were descending at an alarming rate. "Leonard," the flight attendant asked, her voice shaking, "what are you doing?" "Stabilizing the plane," Leonard said, though his own voice betrayed his nerves. He grabbed the radio headset, his hand shaking as he placed it over his ears and adjusted the microphone. The noise of the alarms dulled slightly with the headset on, but it did nothing to steady his pounding heart. He pressed the button to open communication. "Mayday, Mayday," he shouted into the radio. "This is Flight 212. Both pilots are unconscious, and we're losing altitude. We need help. Please respond." Static crackled for a terrifying moment, and Leonard thought he might be too late. But then, a calm, measured voice broke through. "Flight 212, this is Miami Air Traffic Control. Who am I speaking to?" Leonard exhaled shakily, gripping the microphone. "My name is Leonard Thompson. I'm a passenger. I know how to read the instruments and fly simulators. I need help." There was a brief pause on the other end, as though the controller couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then the voice came back, firm and steady. "Understood, Leonard. I need you to stay calm. Can you confirm your current altitude and airspeed?" Leonard's eyes darted to the panel. "We're at 12,500 feet, and our speed is 330 knots. He swallowed hard. "We're still descending." "Okay, Leonard. Listen carefully. We need to stabilize your altitude. Do you see the control yoke in front of you?" Leonard nodded even though the controller couldn't see him. "Yes." "Pull back on the yoke, slowly, to level out the nose of the plane. Don't pull too hard, or you'll stall the aircraft. Keep an eye on the artificial horizon." Leonard's hands trembled as he wrapped them around the yoke. It was heavier than he expected, resisting his touch like a sleeping giant. He pulled back gently, feeling the vibrations of the aircraft through his fingertips. The nose of the plane responded sluggishly, but it was enough. The artificial horizon indicator began to level out, the blue sky on top balancing with the brown earth below. "We're leveling out," Leonard reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Good job, Leonard. Now hold it steady. I'll guide you step by step." The next few minutes were a blur of focus and fear. Leonard followed the air traffic controller's instructions, adjusting the throttle to reduce speed and activating the autopilot to hold the plane's altitude. The blaring alarms faded one by one, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost worse. Sweat dripped down Leonard's face as he double-checked every switch and gauge. The flight attendant stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly. "Leonard," she whispered, her voice thick with awe. "You're doing it." Leonard didn't look away from the controls. "Not yet," he said. "We still have to land." The word hung in the air like a lead weight. For the first time, Leonard allowed himself to think about what came next, landing the plane. He had stabilized it for now, but the hardest part, the part where lives hung in the balance, was still ahead. The controller's voice crackled in his ear again. "Leonard, you're doing great. Now listen carefully. We're going to set you up for an approach to Miami International Airport. It's going to be tricky, but we'll be with you every step of the way. Are you ready?" Leonard's small hands tightened on the yoke. The reality of what he was doing, what he had to do, settled like a stone in his chest. He was just a kid. But right now, none of that mattered. "I'm ready," he said. And he meant it. Descent into danger. Leonard's fingers hovered over the controls, trembling slightly as he absorbed every word from the air traffic controller on the other end of the radio. Around him, the cockpit still crackled with blaring alarms and flashing warning lights, a chaotic symphony of danger that refused to relent. The hum of the engines pulsed through the floor beneath his feet, a constant reminder of the enormous machine he was now responsible for. He gripped the control yoke tighter, his knuckles white. "Leonard," the calm voice of Miami Air Traffic Control came through the headset once again. "You've stabilized the plane beautifully. Now we need to prepare for the descent. The storm ahead is going to make this challenging, so I need you to stay focused, all right?" Leonard nodded, even though the controller couldn't see him. He couldn't bring himself to speak just yet. He was fighting to keep his emotions under control. Fear, self-doubt, the crushing realization that he was just a kid in a cockpit built for professionals. But there was no one else to do this. The pilots were still slumped unconscious, their heads gently bobbing with the plane's movements. The flight attendant, her face still pale and strained, stood to Leonard's left. Her voice broke the silence. "Leonard, they're saying the storm is bad." How bad? Leonard bit his lip, his eyes flicking to the radar display. His aviation knowledge allowed him to read the radar's ominous display of flashing green, yellow, and deep red. Pockets of violent weather marked by furious updrafts, lightning, and unpredictable winds. It's bad, he admitted quietly. We're going to fly through a squall line. Wind shear, hail, downdrafts. It's all there. The attendant swallowed hard, her eyes betraying her terror. And we have to land through that. Leonard turned back to the radio. His voice finally emerged, steadier than he felt. Miami, there's a storm on the radar. How can I land through it? Isn't there another way? The controller replied quickly, his calm tone like an anchor in the chaos. Leonard, you're right. This storm is intense, but diverting to another airport isn't an option right now. You're already on a rapid descent path, and we don't want you to lose altitude control again. You're going to have to fly through it. Leonard's heart thudded heavily in his chest. What do I do? Listen closely. First, reduce the throttle to slow your airspeed. We don't want you hitting turbulent air at high speed. Next, lower the flaps to 15 degrees to prepare for descent. You'll feel the plane's drag increase. Leonard reached for the throttle levers, his fingers slick with sweat. He pulled back gently, feeling the engines respond as the roar softened slightly. He then shifted his focus to the flap controls. He had practiced this maneuver countless times on his flight simulator at home, but the stakes had never been. As the flaps deployed, the plane vibrated briefly before settling into a slower, more deliberate glide. Speed reduced, flaps set to 15, Leonard reported, his voice slightly breathless. Perfect, Leonard, the controller praised. Now, keep the plane steady. You're about 20 miles from the runway. I'm going to walk you through your approach. Can you see the ILS display, the instrument landing system, on the navigation panel? Leonard searched for the display, quickly locating the crosshair-like instrument that would guide him to the correct descent angle and direction. I see it, he said, his voice rising with hope. The familiar display gave him a flicker of confidence. Good. The ILS will guide you down the glide slope, step by step. Follow the vertical and horizontal indicators carefully, and adjust your pitch and heading as needed. We're going to bring you in nice and easy. Leonard exhaled shakily, his pulse quickening as the weight of what was coming settled on him like a stone. This was it. The descent had begun. The descent through the storm. The plane shuddered violently as it entered the first layer of storm clouds. Outside the cockpit windows, the world vanished into a swirling blur of gray. Raindrops pelted the windshield in torrents, their impact loud and relentless. Flashes of lightning split the sky, illuminating the clouds for fleeting moments, like explosions in the darkness. Leonard's grip on the yoke tightened as the plane rocked from side to side, buffeted by powerful gusts of wind. He fought to keep it steady, sweat dripping down his temples. The storm was alive, an angry, unrelenting force determined to wrench control from his hands. Leonard, stay calm. The controller's voice crackled through the headset. That's wind shear. You'll feel sudden drops and climbs, but you've got this. Don't overcorrect. Small, steady movements. Leonard nodded, focusing all his energy on the artificial horizon and the ILS display. The vertical indicator dipped slightly, signaling that the plane was dropping below the glide slope. Leonard pulled back gently on the yoke, bringing the nose up. Behind him, the flight attendant whispered soft reassurances into her portable radio, relaying progress to the cabin. Passengers gripped their armrests, many silently praying. Rachel sat with her face buried in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "Please, please let him be okay." As Leonard fought the controls, the storm grew angrier. A sudden downdraft hit the plane, sending it plunging downward. Leonard's stomach lurched as alarms blared once again. "Stall! Stall!" The automated warning system repeated, the sharp voice cutting through the chaos. "Leonard, Push the nose down, the controller shouted. You're stalling. Add throttle and recover. Leonard slammed the throttles forward, feeling the engines roar to life beneath him. He pushed the nose down slightly, counteracting the stall. The plane surged forward, gaining speed. Slowly, the artificial horizon indicator began to level again. Leonard gasped for breath, his chest heaving. He could feel his arms trembling from the sheer force of holding the yoke steady. His body ached, but there was no time to stop. You recovered beautifully, Leonard. The controller's voice broke through. You're almost there. 10 miles to the runway. Leonard blinked away tears of exhaustion. What about the landing gear? He asked hoarsely. There was a pause on the radio. Then the controller replied, try deploying the landing gear now. The indicator will tell you if it's locked. Leonard reached for the landing gear lever and pulled it down. A mechanical hum filled the cockpit, but it was followed by a blinking red light. Landing gear not fully deployed, Leonard reported, panic rising in his voice. It's stuck. The flight attendant's face paled. What does that mean? It means we might have to land without landing gear, Leonard said grimly, his mind racing. But first, we have to try the manual override. Leonard, the controller's voice returned. There's a manual crank lever below the co-pilot's seat. Use it to force the landing gear down. Leonard's heart pounded as he reached down, his fingers fumbling for the crank handle. He found it and began to turn it, the metal groaning in protest. Sweat poured down his face as he cranked with all his strength, his arms burning. Come on, he whispered desperately. Come on. Suddenly, the red light flickered and turned green. Landing gear deployed. Leonard shouted, relief washing over him like a wave. The controller's voice broke in, full of pride. Fantastic work, Leonard. You're lined up with the runway. One more step. You need to slow the plane down and flare the nose just before touch. Leonard nodded, his focus razor sharp. I can do this. The runway lights appeared in the distance, cutting through the storm like a beacon of hope. Leonard's hands shook as he adjusted the throttle, slowing the plane's speed as they descended. The ILS indicators guided him perfectly now, and for the first time, Leonard felt like he was truly in control. The cockpit was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the instruments and the roar of the wind outside. Leonard's breathing slowed as he prepared for the final moments. Leonard, the controller said softly, you're almost home. Just hold steady. You've got this. With his heart in his throat, Leonard whispered to himself, one step at a time. The runway loomed larger with every passing second, the ground rising up to meet them. This was it, the final approach. The runway lights shone like a distant constellation, flickering through sheets of torrential rain as Leonard guided the plane closer to the earth. The storm still raged outside, lightning illuminating the clouds in brief, violent flashes. Each bolt seemed to strike with a force that made the air tremble, but Leonard's eyes remained locked on the runway growing larger ahead. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the stormy tension that filled the cockpit. His breathing was shallow, his small chest rising and falling as though the effort of keeping the plane steady demanded every ounce of energy he had left. He could hear his mother's distant sobs echoing faintly behind the cockpit door, along with the whispered prayers of passengers bracing for impact. Somewhere deep inside, Leonard wished he could be sitting back there too, clutching his mom's hand, safe from all of this. But this was his fight. Leonard, came the air traffic controller's steady voice through the headset. You're looking good on the approach. Remember, as you near the runway, you'll need to flare the nose, gently, just a few degrees upward to soften the landing. And don't forget to deploy the speed brakes once you're down. Leonard swallowed hard, gripping the yoke as though it might slip from his sweaty palms. The runway now dominated the horizon, growing larger and larger until it felt like the earth itself was rising to meet them. Roger that, Leonard replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Hold steady, flare the nose, speed brakes after touchdown. That's it. The controller said encouragingly, "Keep her aligned." Storm's wrath. But as Leonard's trembling hands adjusted the plane's descent, the storm unleashed one final brutal attack. A sudden gust of wind struck the plane, hammering against the fuselage like a giant's fist. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, its nose wobbling off course. Leonard's stomach dropped as the alarms blared to life once more. "Wind shear, wind shear." The automated system screamed, its robotic voice a chilling reminder of their fragile position. Leonard's heart raced. He tightened his grip on the yoke, fighting the wind's pull with every ounce of strength he had. The artificial horizon wobbled, the indicators on the instrument panel fluctuating wildly. "Leonard," the controller's voice rose in urgency. "Counter the drift. Use small corrections. Don't overreact." Leonard nodded frantically, even though his mind screamed at him to do more. He pushed the yoke slightly to the right, careful not to overcompensate, while adding just enough throttle to keep the speed steady. The gust fought back, the plane rocking violently, but Leonard held on. "Come on, come on," he whispered through gritted teeth. Outside, the runway tilted and straightened, then tilted again. For a terrifying moment, Leonard feared he wouldn't be able to realign the aircraft in time. But then, miraculously, the gust relented. Leonard adjusted the heading and watched as the runway came back into view, perfectly centered in his line of sight. The calm voice of the controller broke through the static. "You're back on course, Leonard. Great job. You're at 500 feet. Prepare to flare soon. Reduce throttle as you approach." Leonard exhaled a shaky breath, but stayed laser-focused. The plane was descending fast. Outside the windows, he could see the runway lights growing larger, brighter, and more defined against the storm-darkened ground. "Flaps to 30 degrees, Leonard muttered, pushing the lever to extend the flaps further. The plane shuddered, its speed dropping as drag increased, but Leonard kept it steady. The storm continued to rage around them, but for the first time, Leonard felt as though he was pushing back, controlling the uncontrollable. The moment of truth. At 100 feet, Leonard's pulse thundered in his ears. The ground was now a solid force beneath him, and the details of the runway became startlingly clear. Puddles from the rain, emergency vehicles flashing their lights in anticipation, and rows of bright lights stretching endlessly in either direction. "Leonard," the controller's voice softened, "you're almost there. At 50 feet, gently pull back on the yoke to flare the nose. Keep it steady." 50 feet, Leonard whispered, his voice shaking. He kept his eyes glued to the altimeter and the ground ahead, his hands trembling but controlled. The plane dipped lower. 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. Leonard's heart hammered against his ribs as he pulled back gently on the yoke. The nose rose slightly, and the sensation of descent slowed. It was almost like the plane was fighting him, begging to hit the ground harder, but he held firm. 10 feet. "Now," the controller called. Leonard cut the throttle completely. The engines roared one final time before quieting, the plane gliding forward in a smooth arc. The world seemed to freeze. For a split second, Leonard couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Time slowed as the landing gear touched the wet tarmac with a heavy thud. The impact jolted him in his seat, the sound echoing through the cockpit like a gunshot. The aircraft bounced slightly before settling, its massive wheels screeching against the rain-soaked runway. Leonard's instincts kicked in. "Speed brakes," he shouted to himself, reaching for the control lever and yanking it back. He felt the plane drag to a crawl as the speed brakes deployed, rising from the wings to slow them down. The reverse thrusters roared to life a second later, pushing the aircraft against its momentum as the nose lowered. Through the cockpit windows, Leonard could see the runway lights rushing past in a blur, but they were slowing down. Finally, miraculously, slowing down. The plane shuddered to a stop at the far end of the runway. For a moment, all was silent except for the faint patter of rain against the windshield. A hero among us. Leonard slumped back in the co-pilot's seat, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted a marathon. His entire body ached. His arms felt heavy, his legs numb, and his head light with exhaustion. But they were alive. He had done it. Leonard, the air traffic controller's voice came through one final time. Soft but full of awe. You landed the plane. You did it, Hid. Leonard pulled the headset off, his breathing shaky, and looked back at the flight attendant, who stood frozen in shock. Go tell them, Leonard croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell everyone we're safe. The flight attendant nodded, tears streaming down her face as she ran out of the cockpit. Moments later, a cheer erupted from the cabin, a sound of pure relief, joy, and disbelief. Leonard could hear his mother's sobs somewhere in the background, her cries now filled with relief instead of terror. Reunion. Minutes later, the cockpit door burst open, and Rachel ran inside. Her face was streaked with tears, her hair disheveled, but her expression was one of pure love and pride. Leonard, she cried, throwing her arms around him. You're okay. You did it. My brave boy, you saved us all. Leonard let her hold him as the weight of the ordeal finally sank in. His small body trembled with the release of adrenaline, but a faint, weary smile touched his lips. I knew I could do it, Mom, he whispered. I just didn't think it'd be today. Rachel laughed through her tears, holding him tighter. You're my hero, Leo. You're everyone's hero. As Leonard looked out through the cockpit window, he could see the emergency vehicles and airport crews rushing toward the plane. The storm had finally begun to clear, and in the distance, a hint of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the soaked runway. For Leonard Thompson, the 12-year-old who had dreamed of flying, this moment was the beginning of something greater. He had faced the unimaginable, and through courage, knowledge, and an unshakable resolve, he had turned a nightmare into a miracle. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, Leonard knew one thing for sure. He would fly again. A boy becomes a legend. The rumble of engines had long since fallen silent, replaced by the shriek of emergency vehicle sirens and the low hum of voices, a mix of relief and disbelief. The air around the tarmac felt heavy, damp from the rainstorm that was now dissipating, giving way to streaks of sunlight that painted the soaked runway in hues of gold. For those who had been on Flight 212, it felt like they had been reborn. In the cockpit, Leonard remained slumped in the co-pilot's seat, too drained to move, his small hands still resting limply on the control yoke. It was only when the flight attendant gently touched his shoulder that he seemed to stir, blinking as though waking from a... Leonard, they're coming for you, she said softly, tears still wet on her cheeks. You did it. You saved us all. Leonard turned slowly, his face pale but calm, as if part of him still couldn't believe it. He glanced at the still unconscious pilots, their oxygen masks finally doing their job, before looking out the window at the massive activity surrounding the plane. Fire trucks, ambulances, and airport staff rushing about like an army of ants. A moment later, the cockpit door opened again, and Rachel burst in. Her eyes were red, her face streaked with tears, but her expression was one of unrelenting pride. She threw her arms around Leonard, hugging him so tightly that he thought his ribs might crack. You're okay, she sobbed into his hair. You're okay, my brave boy. Leonard clung to her, the weight of the moment finally catching up to him. Tears burned his own eyes as he whispered, I didn't think I could do it, Mom, but I just had to try. Rachel pulled back to look at him, cradling his face in her trembling hands. Leonard, you didn't just try. You did it. You saved us. You saved everyone. The first steps outside. When Leonard finally stepped off the plane, his small, rain-soaked sneakers hitting the tarmac, he was met with the stunned faces of passengers, crew members, and emergency responders. There were no words at first. People simply stared at him as though he were a ghost, as though their minds couldn't process the fact that this small, unassuming boy had been the one to guide them safely back to Earth. Then suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "He's the one who landed the plane." A ripple passed through the crowd as people turned toward Leonard. Rachel held tightly to his hand as passengers began to cheer, clap, and call out his name. The applause grew louder and louder, echoing across the rain-slicked tarmac, and Leonard felt his cheeks flush. He looked down at his shoes, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't why he had done it. He hadn't flown the plane for applause, for cheers, or for recognition. He had done it because there was no other choice, because, for those few hours, he had been the only one who could. The flight attendant stepped forward, smiling through her tears as she knelt in front of him. "Leonard," she said softly, pinning a pair of gold pilot wings onto his shirt. "You've earned these." Leonard looked at the pin, his hands trembling as he touched the cool metal. His chest swelled with emotion, and for the first time since he had landed the plane, a smile broke across his face. The media storm. Within hours, news of the flight had spread across the globe like wildfire. 12-year-old boy lands passenger plane after pilots faint mid-flight. Headlines dominated TV screens, newspapers, and social media platforms. Reporters camped outside Leonard's hotel room, eager for any quote or glimpse of the boy being hailed as a hero. Videos of passengers tearfully recounting the experience went viral. One passenger, an elderly man with a shaking voice, told reporters, "I didn't think I'd live to see another day. That boy saved us. He's not just a hero, he's a miracle." Rachel, overwhelmed by the media attention, did her best to shield Leonard from the chaos. For his part, Leonard found the spotlight uncomfortable. He didn't know how to answer when people asked him what had been going through his mind during the flight, or how he had managed to stay calm. I just did what I knew," he told a reporter during a short interview. "I remembered what I'd read and what I practiced on my simulator. I didn't think. I just did it." To his surprise, people didn't just listen to his words. They celebrated him. Strangers sent letters, gifts, and emails thanking him for his bravery. Airlines reached out with offers to show him around real cockpits, inviting him to meet professional pilots. Aviation experts marveled at his calm under pressure and praised his quick decision-making. The reflection. Back in their hotel room, Leonard sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at the gold pilot wings still pinned to his shirt. Rachel sat beside him, watching him carefully. "You're quiet," she said gently. "Everything okay?" Leonard nodded slowly, but his brow was furrowed with thought. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small. "What if I'd failed? What if I messed up and the plane crashed?" Rachel reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Leonard, you can't think that way. You didn't fail. You succeeded because you trusted yourself. That's what matters." "But I'm not a pilot," Leonard said softly. "I'm just a kid." Rachel smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You're not just anything, Leonard. You're brave. You're smart. And you're more capable than you think. You proved that to yourself, to me, and to the world." Leonard looked down at the pin on his shirt. "Do you think I'll really be a pilot someday?" Rachel took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Leo, you already are." A new journey begins. Months later, Leonard stood on the tarmac of a nearby airport, his heart fluttering with excitement as he gazed at the small Cessna 172 parked in front of him. Beside him stood a tall flight instructor, who smiled warmly as he gestured toward the aircraft. "You ready, Leonard?" the instructor asked. "Today's your first flying lesson." Leonard turned to his mother, who stood a few feet away, smiling through tears of pride. "Go get him, Captain," she called out, her voice filled with love. Leonard grinned and gave her a confident nod before climbing into the cockpit. The familiar feel of the controls beneath his hand sent a thrill through him. This time, there was no storm. There were no alarms, and no lives were hanging in the balance. It was just him, the aircraft, and the endless blue sky waiting for him. As the Cessna's engine roared to life, Leonard's heart swelled with joy. For as long as he could remember, he had dreamed of this moment, the moment where his passion for flight would lift him toward the clouds. The day he saved Flight 212 had been the most terrifying day of his life, but it had also been the moment that defined him, the moment when a shy 12-year-old boy proved to himself that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about acting despite the fear. And as the small aircraft rolled down the runway and gently lifted off into the sky, Leonard looked out the window at the world falling away beneath him. His eyes sparkled with the same excitement they had on that fateful day. But this time, he wasn't just dreaming of being a pilot. He was one. The legacy of flight. Years had passed since that fateful day aboard Flight 212, when a 12-year-old Leonard Thompson had gripped the controls of a massive jetliner and saved over 200 lives. The world had not forgotten him. In fact, his story became legend, a tale shared across generations, taught in classrooms, and celebrated in documentaries. But for Leonard, the weight of that day was not something he carried as a burden. Instead, it became the foundation upon which he built his future, taking to the skies. At 18 years old, Leonard stood on the tarmac of Miami International Airport, staring up at a sleek white jet adorned with the airline's logo. The same airline that had once pinned golden wings to his shirt had now invited him back for something even greater, his first official solo flight as a licensed pilot. His uniform fit snugly, clean navy slacks, a white shirt pressed to perfection, and a crisp captain's hat perched on his head. The pilot wings on his chest gleamed in the sunlight, polished to a mirror shine. These wings weren't just a decoration anymore, they were earned. The airline's CEO and senior pilots stood nearby, watching with pride. The media had gathered again, cameras snapping and reporters whispering excitedly. But Leonard barely noticed them. For him, this moment wasn't about fame or attention. It was about the dream that had never left him, the dream of soaring through the skies, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Rachel stood off to the side, her eyes brimming with tears as she watched her son, now a young man, walking confidently toward the plane. She had seen every step of his journey, from the terrified boy in the cockpit to the calm, focused professional he had become. Leonard paused at the bottom of the stairs leading up to the plane's door and turned to look back at her. He smiled, a smile that said everything words couldn't. "I'm proud of you, Leo," Rachel whispered to herself. "More than you'll ever know." The world watches. Leonard's solo flight wasn't just an achievement for him. It was a global event. News stations from around the world broadcast live footage of his departure, calling him the boy who became a legend. People who had been passengers on Flight 212 sat glued to their TVs, tears in their eyes, as they watched the young man who had once been their savior fulfill his destiny. One such passenger, an elderly woman named Marianne, sat in her living room surrounded by her grandchildren. "That's him," she told them, her voice trembling with emotion. "He saved us all that day, you know. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for him." The children stared wide-eyed at the screen, captivated by the young pilot in his uniform. "He's like a superhero," one of them said. Marianne smiled, nodding slowly. "He's better than a superhero. He's inspiring a generation." Leonard's story sparked something far bigger than he could have imagined. Across the world, young people who had once believed their dreams were out of reach now saw Leonard as proof that anything was possible. Aviation schools reported surges in applicants, many of whom cited Leonard Thompson as their inspiration. One boy, no older than Leonard had been during the flight, wrote a letter to him that read, "Dear Captain Leonard, I saw your story on TV, and I want to be a pilot just like you. My mom says I can't because we don't have money for flight school, but you didn't let anything stop you, so I won't either. Thank you for showing me that even kids can be heroes. Sincerely, Danny, age 11. Leonard received hundreds of letters like this over the years, and each one reminded him of why he had continued to pursue his dream. He answered as many as he could, always signing them. Keep reaching for the skies. Captain Leonard Thompson. The honor of flight. At 25 years old, Leonard stood at a podium in a vast, crowded hall. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum had just unveiled a new exhibit, The Flight of Courage, the Leonard Thompson story. The display included pieces of the cockpit from Flight 212, photos of Leonard as a boy, and recordings of air traffic control from that harrowing day. A replica flight simulator allowed visitors to experience the challenges Leonard had faced. But the centerpiece was a plaque that read, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in the face of it." Leonard Thompson, age 12. Leonard approached the microphone. Now a seasoned pilot with thousands of flight hours under his belt. The crowd fell silent as he began to speak. "I was just a kid when Flight 212 changed my life forever," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I didn't act because I thought I was a hero. I acted because there was no one else to. I'd studied flight my whole life because it was my passion. But that day, passion turned into responsibility." He paused, looking out at the young faces in the crowd. "You don't have to wait until you're older to make a difference. Courage doesn't have an age limit. If you believe in something, if you work for it, there's no limit to what you can achieve." The applause that followed thundered through the hall, a standing ovation that lasted for minutes. Rachel sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son inspire the next generation of dreamers. Captain Thompson's legacy. By his 30s, Leonard had become a celebrated captain, flying international routes across the globe. He mentored young pilots, often sharing his story to remind them that courage and preparation go hand in hand. The legacy of Flight 212 lived on in more ways than one. Leonard started the Courage to Fly Foundation, a nonprofit organization providing scholarships to underprivileged children who dreamed of becoming pilots. The foundation funded flight schools, aviation programs, and mentorship opportunities, ensuring that kids like Leonard, kids with big dreams but limited means, could soar. At an annual gala for the foundation, Leonard was approached by a teenage girl clutching a worn aviation manual. "Captain Leonard?" she asked shyly. Leonard smiled warmly. "That's me." The girl's eyes shone with hope. "I'm going to be a pilot too. I'm already studying. Can you sign my manual?" Leonard took the book, his heart swelling as he saw how much she had written in it. Notes, sketches, and dreams, just like his own manual all those years ago. He signed it with a smile. "Keep reaching for the skies. Captain Leonard Thompson. Soaring forever." On the 20th anniversary of Flight 212, Leonard piloted a ceremonial flight over the same route. Passengers cheered as they landed safely, a symbolic gesture of how far he, and the world, had come since that day. As Leonard stepped into the cockpit after the flight, he looked out through the windshield at the endless horizon. The sun dipped low in the sky, bathing the clouds in gold, just as it had on that fateful morning. He touched the wings pinned to his chest, now weathered but still shining. This wasn't just a job or a title. This was his life, his calling, and his legacy. Leonard Thompson, the boy who once saved a plane, had become more than a legend. He had become a symbol of courage, possibility, and the boundless heights of human determination. And as he pushed the throttle forward, and the engines roared to life, Leonard smiled. He was flying once more, toward the skies, toward the future, and toward the dreams that would forever lift him